Okay, guys. So, as James just mentioned, let's cap off what we've been learning this year, and use Daniel to really highlight all those things that we've learned and been taught, and are now seeking to own for ourselves. Colin did a really good job of, true to Colin form, being thorough last week, and did a good job of, bouncing back between James and Paul's letters to Timothy and so on. I went this last couple weeks. I went and revisited a bunch of old sermons throughout the year, and picked out the key, thoughts and points that we've been learning about what it means to be wise and mature, and how that's beautiful to God, and how Daniel is like a prime model for these things. How many of you guys have read Daniel, other than just hearing what we've talked about in church? The little bits and pieces. Not a lot of you. I saw a couple. Well, you guys really should. Daniel is for me, I think I mentioned this before too. Daniel is awesome. Daniel's awesome. He's like a hero, He's a hero of mine, and he's an example to us as believers. But so earlier this year, James, like the beginning of the year, I think, James talked about wisdom as being first in the heart, and staying pure in the heart, and then how your actions follow suit. From the get-go, we see Daniel wanting to be pure, pure in the heart. And it was touched on last week about how he didn't want to take part in the meal that the meat sacrificed to idols or whatever. And that's from a really young age. Daniel was going into this hotbed, of culture and, society, and he was young, but Daniel knew that, and, who knows what he was going to face in the future, but he did know one thing, that he may not have been able to control much in that environment and situation that he was in, but he wanted to try and honor God in some way. And so he latched onto this example in chapter 1 of that meal that he was going to partake in. And I think it's really relevant for us as believers, especially in society today, especially in Portland today. It's very Babylon-esque. We're a melting pot of all these different cultures and ideas and philosophies and gods or whatever. Do we keep a pure heart like Daniel did? And this is something, like I said, this is something that we need to decide from an early point on. So I guess that's pointed towards younger people, the younger people of our congregation. But do you have that? Do you own that now? Do you want to keep a pure heart when you go out and about, when you interact in your relationships, when you're exposed to whatever, everything, whatever's being thrown at you? Do you keep a pure heart in that? Do you want to honor God in everything that you do, even in the way that you take things in? Is it natural for you to absorb it all, or is it natural for you to have sensors that go off when you see things that's not from God and not pure? And so I think that's a good example of how Daniel kept that pure heart, like James was talking about earlier in the year, and because of that, his actions followed. And I think that it was never Daniel's desire that it would be pointed out in his life. He was put into this position, right? He was plucked, literally, out of this group of people and put into this position. And it's only because of that that he had to like take such a, I guess, public stance on the matter, you know? Yeah, Daniel was plucked out of a group of people, and so that's why it's so known, I guess, and that's why he felt it important to make that stand, because he was in a I don't know how you put that, a public setting. So it was important for him to make that a public stance. So yeah, do we keep a pure heart, and do our actions follow suit in that? This was something we talked about earlier in the year. Again, we talked about it, touched on it last week, but relationships. I think the ending question, and I think it's relevant to ask again and to think about like all the time. Do our relationships like permeate God? Do they like bring people closer to God, or do they push people away? Daniel had multiple kings, you know, who saw God working in his life and saw what was capable in faith in God, and those kings, at least 2 out of the 3 of them, Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, they were brought closer to God to some extent. Whether or not, you know, I don't think you could say that they owned God as their God, you know, or if to them he was just another God that was, you know, capable of awesome things. But regardless, they came to know God closer because of Daniel. And I think that is, again, important to ask ourselves. Does our relationships do that for people? James talked about, well, I guess this is a segue, but it's all sort of similar. They all tie together. But in our relationships, and then Josh gave a sermon on the use of the tongue. Do our relationships lift people up, or do they cut people down? James talked about, you know, like a roast earlier in the year. That's what's like a cool relationship and funny, and that's what's flattering. But that's not what's wise and beautiful. Daniel is, you know, grieved by the things that are coming to the kings, you know, through the dreams and stuff that he's interpreting. He even, I think even at his like, okay, so I think it's chapter 5. It's after Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. Belshazzar, you know, comes in, and he's the king now, and he wants to take these, you know, sacred things from the Jewish temple, you know, the cups and stuff, and he wants to drink out of them and abuse them, you know, and misuse them and just insult God with them by, you know, their ceremony, the way he's using them. I think that even at that moment, you can't say that Daniel is like cutting Belshazzar down. He rebukes him pretty hardcore, but we know that calling people out is godly wisdom, you know, and even publicly, and it looks a certain way. But Daniel is addressing like the issue, and he's not trying to judge Belshazzar. And I think that that's a challenge for us too. Yeah, we can read it. Since how not a lot of you raise your hands about if you've read Daniel before. So chapter 5. I'll give you the preface. There's some writing on the wall. It's during this like meal that they're doing. You know, there's like a hand that appears out of nowhere, so it's pretty vivid imagery. And it writes something. And so Daniel comes in at the request of the king and is asked to explain what it means, because that's what Daniel does. He's an interpreter of dreams and whatnot. So Daniel was brought, verse 13. Daniel was brought in before the king. The king asked him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar? I have heard that you have the spirit of gods within you, and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. I am told that you can give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes and of royal honor, and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Daniel answered the king, "Keep your gifts or give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. He made him so great that people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. He killed those he wanted to kill and spared those he wanted to spare. He honored those he wanted to honor and disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. But when his heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, he was brought down from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven from human society. He was given the mind of a wild animal. He lived among the wild donkeys. He ate grass like a cow, was drenched by the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of the world and appoints anyone he desires to rule over them. You are his successor, O Belshazzar, and you knew all this, yet you have not humbled yourself. For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles and your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny. So God has sent this hand to write this message." He goes on to interpret what it means that basically that kingdom is days are numbered and they're going to be conquered. I forget what movie it's from. I think it's The Knight's Tale. Have you guys seen The Knight's Tale? There's a cool quote. Yeah, R.I.P. There's a cool quote in it where it's like, "You have been weighed and you have been measured and you have been found wanting." That's essentially what Daniel is interpreting. That's the dream, or that's the writing that he's interpreting. Adam paraphrase. Weighed, measured, found wanting. Belshazzar dies that night. Oh, I also think it's funny that even after being told that you're going to die or that your kingdoms are going to be sacked, Belshazzar is like, "Oh, hey, here's a golden robe," or whatever, purple robe. It's really funny to me. Anyways, so even in that moment where we see Daniel at his most harsh with someone, it's not to, Daniel himself is not trying to cut that person down. He's frustrated that Belshazzar has, neglected what his predecessor learned about God in heaven. But Daniel himself is not trying to pass judgment or whatever. He's not trying to cut Belshazzar down. He wants, and that's the thing. He wants reconciliation, and that's what we're striving for. That's what wisdom and maturity is in our relationships is the want for reconciliation. Despite being frustrated or seeing someone suck at something, even in our own body, we see amongst ourselves it's really frustrating to see this person not living up in this way or struggling with this, but we don't say, "Colin, get out of here. You suck at this." We struggle with Colin and we call Colin out. I'm just whatever. we call Colin out, and we want to restore him, and get him back to being righteous and godly. And so Daniel again is a model for us in that, in the way we interact in our relationships, in the way we use our tongue. Daniel had obviously he didn't have an exhaustive understanding of what his and Israel's time looked like while being, captive. But he had an understanding that that's what God had in store for Israel, and he was willing to take or to play his part in that, in God's plan. Do we submit like that to God? Are we willing to submit ourselves to God's sovereignty and God's plan, or do we, not to pick on you, but do we bug ourselves with what's unknown? Do we stress out about what we can control? Daniel didn't appear to be stressed out about this. He knew he had the old scriptures, and he knew what was in store for his people, and he fell in line with that. And in that, he was humble. We know about demonic wisdom being proud and selfish ambition and so on, cuts other people down, these list of things. Even in this position that Daniel was put in, he kept being raised, elevated into like a higher position too while he was captive. But even in this, Daniel was humble, and he wasn't trying to elevate himself. He was always using that position to bring glory to God and to highlight God's power in all these different things, all these different scenarios he found himself in. Do we do the same? Do we use the positions we're in, positions of leadership or positions of mentorship, positions at work, so on and so forth? Do we use that position to like highlight ourselves, or do we use it to, it sounds corny, but do we use it to like honor God? And are we willing to like say that, like I am who I am and I get to where I get to because I know that God is working in my life? Daniel kept doing that throughout the whole time. It was never like, I have this awesome dream, let me whatever, He wasn't opening a dream shop where he was like, come to, Daniel's shop of dreams and I'll tell you what they mean and pay me $100 or whatever. He was always using these gifts from God, for God. Daniel showed maturity in his willingness to like struggle. I can't imagine it was easy for Daniel to, knowing that they are God's chosen people, to be, kidnapped or whatever, taken over by Babylon, by these kings, be given names that literally mean to honor this idol or this god or whatever, this god and that god, to be told to do this, in all these different areas and ways that are like asking him to be unfaithful to God, or implying something else. Daniel struggled with that. It's not like he was like, when he was given his name, he wasn't like, I don't know what a scenario would be, but I would rather die than be given that name and then go jump off a building or something. Daniel, again, had a maturity that we should strive to have. He was willing to like struggle in God's plan for Israel and play his part. Even if it meant, like we alluded to last week, even if it meant dying. And we have examples of that with the furnace and those three guys too. Those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Again, they had a maturity that we should strive for, and a pure heart that we should strive for, despite being basically insulted, even down to their name that they were given. And Daniel was willing to die, and they were willing to die. Lion's den, fiery furnace. You guys should really read Daniel, so I don't have to just feel weird about mentioning briefly a thing. Okay, yeah. So it's all of these things. The way that Daniel lived, the testimony he gave, the way he brought people closer to God, the way he allowed them to know God on some level because his relationship with him. This is why Daniel is, a hero for us as Christians. This is why Gabriel came down and said while Daniel was praying that you're precious to God. The life you've lived, the way your heart, the way it speaks, the way you're praying, that is beautiful in God's sight. This is this is why Daniel is awesome. Daniel's heart was pure. He acted in a godly way. He never sought to glorify himself, only God. He showed maturity in recognizing his and Israel's position and still maintaining a pure heart and struggling in that. He was never bitter. That's important. When we, enter situations, interactions, relationships, are we bitter, or do we have a heart and a mind and an attitude that wants relationship, wants to glorify God? We're no good if we're just pissed off and whatever, high and mighty. He never wanted personal gain in his position of authority. He was, I think at the pinnacle, he was like the third highest in Babylon. Does that sound right? Does that sound right, Colin? I think at the very end, maybe second. He was almost like the king. In some ways he was. He decided things for the king or whatever, influenced the king greatly, or God did. But he never sought to use that for himself. He never wanted to destroy relationships, as I said, but instead build them up. So how are you guys like Daniel? How are you not like Daniel? How do you want to be like Daniel? I asked a couple questions throughout the sermon. How do you keep a pure heart when you enter into, a scenario, when you intake information, when you are in an environment that is telling you something that is not from God, that is not godly wisdom? How do you keep a pure heart in all of that? How do you stay true to what you know of God? Or are you easily swayed, and is your heart easily changed and your mind easily changed? How is your attitude in that? How do you struggle? How do you struggle like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego struggled? These are things you guys should discuss. Think about Daniel and how you want to be like Daniel in those ways, in showing wisdom and maturity. And talk about it. Thank you.